Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani reportedly rejects a U.S. proposal that would replace the current administration with an interim government. Hello, I'm Untitled. This is The Heat. With just weeks left before a deadline to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan, Washington is pushing for a peace deal between the Kabul government and the Taliban, ending 2 decades of war. The United States is circulating a proposal calling for Ashraf Ghani's government to be replaced with an interim administration, something the Afghan leader opposes. President Ghani is instead floating new presidential elections in 6 months. For more on the crisis in Afghanistan, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Omar Samad served as Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Also in Washington, Michael Kugelman is Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Ahmad Shah Mohibi is the founder and president of the non-profit organization Rise to Peace. And in Virginia, Shuja Nawaz is Distinguished Fellow South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Ambassador Omar Samad, let me start with you. As I said, the United States is proposing this interim government in Afghanistan before election, and that has been roundly rejected by the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. He wants to call for elections instead. So where does it leave the process and the political situation in Afghanistan?
Well, Anand, to be quite specific about this, the United States hasn't per se yet asked for an interim government. If you remember, Secretary of State Blinken sent a letter, and there was also another document that talks about an interim or transitional period in the future. But what we are seeing now is obviously President Ghani pushing back and saying that he prefers elections 6 months down the road, something that is very impractical. We saw the last elections in Afghanistan in 2019 be extremely problematic, full of questions and allegations of fraud, and it took 6 months at least for it to result in some kind of arrangement, and the Taliban were not involved. And remember, almost half of Afghanistan is controlled by the Taliban, more or less, and so it's going to require the Taliban agreeing to this, and I don't think that they will, because they would like to see a political arrangement, a deal, or an agreement to move the process towards a transition. And that transition may include, as you said, an interim government and a reduction in violence, leading later on to hopefully a ceasefire, and for all Afghans to agree to, for example, a new constitution down the road. So it's a whole process, and I think Ashraf Ghani is trying to obviously do something that he thinks is to his benefit, but I think that most people think that it's not practical.
Ambassador, that transition that you talk about, is the Taliban prepared to have elections first and then move to a transition, or transition first?
No, from what we know, the Taliban would like to first of all sit down with all Afghans, including people from the government, and talk about all the problems that this country has had for all these years, and then focus on an agenda which may include and should include a constitution, a new constitution that everyone can agree to, and then that constitution should pave the way towards elections, hopefully elections, and some type of participation of the Afghan people in determining their future.
Shuja Nawaz, of course, one of the very important regional players in this is Pakistan. Pakistan has played an important role in getting the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghan government as well as the United States. In fact, U.S. Defense Secretary, who was on a visit to Afghanistan, he said he praised Pakistan's cooperation for peace. And the Taliban so far has rejected the idea of an interim government or of any kind of ceasefire. So, Shuja, what kind of leverage does Pakistan have that could result in a deal, a power-sharing government of some kind?
I think Pakistan needs to be realistic about the fact that it doesn't have a great deal of leverage, and the Pakistani leadership, civil and military, have reiterated that numerous times, publicly as well as to their American counterparts. The fact that they do have the families of the Taliban residing inside Pakistan leadership residing inside Pakistan, and then maybe even the Taliban leaders using Pakistan as an occasional base gives them some leverage. However, they cannot persuade the Taliban to go and sit and agree to a particular deal. That really will depend on what I consider a much more multivariate equation. It's not a simple one of Pakistan, Taliban, and the Afghan government. It's a question of bringing in Iran, bringing in India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, all to contribute to some kind of a framework. As Ambassador Samad was saying, maybe some kind of a meeting, maybe not in Bonn this time, maybe in Istanbul, which would bring all the parties together within a determined short period to hammer out a framework for understanding, which will then lead to the transition and maybe to fresh elections.
Well, in fact, Turkey has announced that it will be hosting a meeting between the various parties next month in April in Turkey.
I think that will do the trick. It's very critical that all the parties talk to each other rather than going through cutouts. And Pakistan certainly cannot play the role of political scotch tape in all of this, trying to cobble together some kind of an agreement, because Pakistan doesn't have the leverage either with the Afghan government or with the Taliban alone.
Michael Kugelman, President Biden was asked about the situation in Afghanistan in an interview with the American network ABC News. This was a week ago. And he was asked about that tentative withdrawal date. That's the withdrawal of U.S. troops of May 1st. That was a date that was negotiated by the former Trump administration. Let's watch part of that interview.
That was not a very solidly negotiated deal that the former president, worked out. And so we're in consultation with our allies as well as the government, and that decision's going to be, it's in process now.
Likely to take longer?
I don't think a lot longer.
But May 1st is tough.
Could happen, but it is tough.
So, Michael, I mean, can that date be met, that deadline?
No, it's very unlikely. I mean, we're getting close to a point where even if the administration decided it wanted to leave by then, it likely wouldn't have time logistically. I mean, it's easy enough to get 3,500 troops out of Afghanistan. That's the number of U.S. troops there now. But you have all the equipment and the heavy machinery and the weaponry, and that takes a lot of time to pack up and get out. And we're talking about 4 to 5 weeks now. So, you know, I think it's increasingly unlikely that the administration will get out by then. I think that the administration is trying to do things that can create the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan for a withdrawal of troops later on, beyond May 1st. I think what the Biden administration wants to do is do whatever it can to get the violence down and get the peace talks going again. I mean, nothing is really happening now. The Biden administration would feel much more comfortable withdrawing under those conditions. Of course, the problem, as you know, is that the Taliban insists that all U.S. troops have to be gone no matter what on May 1st, because that's what the agreement that it signed with the U.S., with the Trump administration more than a year ago, says. And so that's why there's such a conundrum here. And of course, the Biden administration has no good option, because if it does stay beyond May 1st and it doesn't get the Taliban to agree to that, the Taliban could well resume its war against the U.S. It has stopped attacking U.S. forces. So the violence could increase. U.S. forces could find themselves under fire again. But of course, if the U.S. Were to try to pull troops by May 1st or soon thereafter, without any more progress in the peace talks, then things could get even worse in Afghanistan. The Taliban would be in a strong position to make major gains, including going into cities, because Afghan forces would no longer have the security blanket, so to speak, or the backup of U.S. air power to help Afghan forces when the Taliban tries to make forays into cities. So to answer your question, the bottom line is no. I think it's increasingly unlikely that we will see U.S. troops leaving the country by that deadline. But that does have some very troubling implications.
Right, Michael, when you say get the violence down in order to give the United States time to make a safe withdrawal from the country, what needs to happen? I mean, what would you expect to happen in this time? Because the U.S. has been there for 20 years.
Well, what the Biden administration wants to do is it wants to get the Taliban to agree to a violence reduction accord, which indeed will be very hard to do. The Taliban has, for so long, used violence as a tool of leverage. It ratchets it up on the battlefield to try to strengthen its bargaining position in talks. And it really, the agreement that it signed with the Trump administration more than a year ago does not oblige the Taliban to reduce violence. It does oblige it to not stage attacks on U.S. forces anymore, but it says nothing about fighting Afghan forces. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get the Taliban to agree to reduce its violence anytime soon, unfortunately, and certainly so long as U.S. forces remain in the country. But certainly it's possible. I think we shouldn't rule it out, and that is really the major objective, certainly for Washington and for its NATO partners and other allies, to try to figure out a way to build an incentive structure where you can somehow get the Taliban to agree to reduce violence. But the Taliban would demand a lot in return in order to do that.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, what are your thoughts on this? As we just heard, the Taliban says, look, we signed the agreement with the United States, and part of that agreement is that the U.S. withdraw by May 1st. Let's listen to Suhail Shaheen. He's a member of the Taliban negotiating team. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
We had 18 months of negotiation with the Americans, and they agreed that they will withdraw in 14 months. If they do not go at the end of April, that means they continue. After that, it will be a kind of a violation of the agreement. That violation would not be from our side, but it would be from their side. So in that case, if there is action, of course there will be reaction.
So, Ahmad, there's the Taliban saying that they signed the agreement. If the United States does not leave by May 1st, there will be consequences. We heard that spokesman say that they will respond. So where does it go to from here?
I think it's time to reverse. It's time to make the Taliban accountable for what they have done. Look, the deal was done last year in February 29th. I was in Afghanistan in March. That during the entire negotiating and the political crisis between Dr. Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, the deal was signed based on condition. The Taliban did not fulfill all the commitments. Look, they haven't cut ties with Al-Qaeda. There's UN report supporting that. The Afghan National Director of Security report that the Taliban, in fact, supporting Al-Qaeda and recruiting more of them by saying that we defeated the superpower, the Americans, we won, we succeeded. There is a narrative, there's a propaganda about the Taliban going. The Taliban did not reduce violence. Violence escalated in Afghanistan. Social and political activists in Afghanistan has been targeted. Journalists has been targeted. So on top of that, they got 5,000 prisoners, and then later on, the Louis Jirga decided 400 by name requested top terrorists that were detained in background detention facility. So it's time to make the Taliban be accountable. It's time to counterback at them. Yes, they can say whatever they want, but let's talk about realistically. What's happening on the ground in Afghanistan. It's a mess. There's a political crisis, and Taliban needs to understand that the deal was a condition-based. And I also see a possible extension for President Biden, because May 1st, there's no possibility. Yes, there are equipments, Humvees, all those MRAPs are given to the Afghan security forces, but it's impossible. I mean, going back to what's happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban, I see three alternatives or options for the U.S. administration. I mean, number one, leave. And there will be civil war, there will be chaos, there will be safe havens of terrorists, and that will put a bad credibility on the U.S. And number two is to go back to Operation Enduring Freedom. I remember in 2003, 2004, and 2005, Afghanistan was really safe. Taliban were in Pakistan, neighboring countries, regrouped, they came back. 2006 and beyond started really bad. So that is to support Afghan security forces, air support, financial, intelligence, all reconnaissance. And the third is support the peace talks. And I believe that the negotiating settlement in Afghanistan is the best alternative. However, keeping a small number of troops is essential. It's number one because diplomacy works when there's military pressure on the ground. It doesn't work with the Taliban. We understand Taliban's techniques of violence. As Michael mentioned, with a violence, they have nothing, and that's why it gives them more hand in a negotiation. So you have to stay in Afghanistan because the job is not done yet. The mission is not done yet.
All right.
So that's how...
Yeah, I just want to go to Ambassador Omar Samad. Ambassador, you just heard the three options there. Do you agree those are the only options? Because it would seem that the only viable option is option 3, which is reach a peace agreement.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just say that we are not in 2001 or 2. We are in 2021, 20 years later, and the ground situation, as our friend said, is very different. Back then, there were no Taliban. The Taliban re-emerged in 2004 and 5. So if you had peace and stability, it was because they were back in their homes or in Pakistan in their camps. So the situation is different. Number 2, today, there are very strong indications that the war option is off the table. The war option is only available to those who benefit from the war and the continuation of the war, and that is not good for Afghanistan, and that is not good for the people of Afghanistan, and that's not good for the region. What is happening right now are negotiations going on with the Taliban on extending the American stay for just a few months, maybe 3 to 6 months. And I think that President Biden, who will probably make an announcement in the next few days, is waiting to hear what the result of these negotiations behind closed doors is going to be in terms of the Taliban agreeing to a 3 to 6 month extension of Americans gradually leaving while there is a transition in place. And that transition is going to take place in Turkey, as was mentioned earlier, in the next few weeks, early in April, in the first month of April, right before Ramadan. And the Taliban are the ones who told the Americans that they're willing to negotiate a reduction in violence back in December. It is being, again, discussed right now as we speak. So all of these things are happening. We are not in 2001 or 2. We are not 2 months earlier. We are today at the end of March 2021, and the diplomatic political ball is rolling. Nobody is really thinking about going back to war in Afghanistan. That is not a very sane or very smart way of addressing the Afghanistan problem.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, very quickly, do you agree that, you know, what you said was option 2, a return to war, a resumption of Operation Enduring Freedom, is not really an option because nobody benefits from that? It doesn't go any way towards resolving this.
Yes, well, option 3 is what I think is the best in Afghanistan. Yes, I agree with Mr. Ambassador that war is not the solution. But when I'm talking about 2001 and 2 and 3, and later on when I started working with the DoD, you know, they're the same Taliban I see today. Their ideology haven't changed yet. So they're the same Taliban who killed Afghans and shouted doubt to Americans. So what I'm saying right now is that those are alternative options, but when it comes to reality, what's happening in Afghanistan, what is the Americans, what is the Afghans want, it is the negotiated settlement. But there's one thing to remind, and I'm going to emphasize on that, that the U.S. troops' presence in Afghanistan gives a moral support to the Afghans. When I was in Afghanistan last March, Afghans were concerned that the gains will be lost. If there is an American force or base, the Taliban, the Afghans will understand that Taliban will never attack these bases and you will be safe. So negotiating settlement is the option, but you have to look at what's happening, the situation on the ground. That requires U.S. troops, NATO to stay as long as there's a solid peace process going and happening. If we go back to 1990s, there's going to be a crisis. There's going to be a lot of war and civil war.
All right.
The U.S. has to make sure that the war is being cut clean and find the credibility in the world.
Shuja Nawaz, I want to look again at the regional implications of what is happening right now. The U.S. Institute for Peace says the most consequential regional competition for influence in Afghanistan is between India and Pakistan, and it categorizes it this way. India is using soft power and Pakistan is backing militant force in Afghanistan. So will it be in Pakistan's interest to pursue a solution that would reduce India's influence in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, and I think the fact that there is now some sign of a thaw in the relationship between India and Pakistan is a good sign. And the fact that the United States is now actively engaged with both the Pakistani and the Indian governments behind the scenes to make sure that that thaw continues. And so are the Gulf states, the UAE, and maybe the Saudis are involved in this. I think all this can only help. We haven't talked about Iran because Iran is a very critical part of this equation. If the United States brings Iran into the equation, they can certainly use their influence with the Taliban as well as with the Afghan government for talks to persist. I want to go back to the point that is being made repeatedly. We use the euphemism of reduction of violence. I think Ramadan offers a great opportunity. The Muslim calendar offers an opportunity for a ceasefire, not just a reduction in violence. And if that can occur in talks between these groups in Istanbul, then I think the United States can then negotiate a quiet, slow withdrawal and save face. That's all it's looking for. And the Afghan parties can then talk to each other and work out a framework for a transition, whether there'll be an interim government or not. But I think the possibility of an election, which would have to be financed by the rest of the world, is really not going to happen, because $88 billion plus, and 20 years later, the war is not over, and more money is not going to be thrown at that problem.
Michael Kugelman, we were talking earlier on about the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, but there are also several thousand NATO forces in Afghanistan right now as well. And the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, he said that no decision has been taken on the withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan. If U.S. forces do pull out, do you see any kind of agreement that would leave any other NATO forces in there?
Yeah, that's unlikely. Probably if U.S. forces leave, the rest of the NATO contingent will too. And it's ironic because there are many more forces from other NATO countries than there are U.S. forces. You've got about 3,000, 3,500 U.S. forces, and you have, I believe, about 6,000, 7,000 soldiers from other NATO countries, maybe even a bit more. But the bottom line is that NATO forces, non-U.S. NATO forces, are dependent on U.S. forces for logistics and other type of support. But it is notable that many NATO capitals have been very public in expressing their concerns about a precipitate withdrawal, which raises the suggestion that maybe there's not really the type of close consultation that you would like there to be between the U.S. and its NATO partners. And there has been some reportage indicating that some European capitals are unhappy that the U.S. had not been consulting with other NATO partners before the U.S. came out with this new proposed peace plan for Afghanistan. That's surprising, given that the Biden administration has said that it wants to restore alliances and so on and so forth. So at the least, you would hope that Washington and other NATO capitals will be coordinating more closely. But yeah, bottom line is that it's very unlikely that you'd have international forces from other NATO countries staying in Afghanistan if and when the remaining U.S. forces leave as well, which is another reason why it's so dangerous for Afghanistan if you have the withdrawal of U.S. forces, because you wouldn't have, the 3,000, 3,500 U.S. troops leaving. You'd have the 10, 11,000 altogether in terms of all of the NATO forces, because they would leave pretty soon after the U.S. forces go.
Anand?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Just jump in quickly.
Go.
I'm sure Michael knows today Secretary Blinken was in Brussels, had meetings with NATO foreign ministers and the NATO Secretary General. They came out and openly and very frankly said that they are going to decide together. Once Washington decides, then everyone is going to look at it, and they are going to decide as to what to do next, how to adjust, and also when to leave together. As they went in together, they will leave together. So that is the policy, and I think that is what is going to happen. It all depends on how the political track moves forward.
Ambassador, I want to stay with you for this next question, and that is the role of Turkey in this. As I said earlier on, Turkey has announced that it will be hosting talks in Istanbul to try and resolve this. In fact, the Turkish website, Daily Sabah, influential website, said Turkey is a powerful player in this, and I'm quoting it, it says, it is perhaps the only country that can ensure peace and stability in Afghanistan. How important would Turkey be as a power broker?
Well, Turkey is a friend, is a Muslim country, has historical ties with Afghanistan, has played a very constructive role over the last 20 years, either within the NATO umbrella or outside of it. I think it's trusted by most Afghans, including the Taliban, perhaps. So it will be able to and can play a very important role. And remember that so far, Qatar has played that role. Qatar has also been very helpful in pushing the Afghan peace process forward. I think what you're going to see is more of an Islamic flavor to the political and peace process moving forward. And I think that countries like Turkey and Qatar and others are going to play a more hands-on role in trying to make sure that the Afghans are going to sit around the table and talk the talk that is needed. Also, do remember that there is a new UN mission that is starting. A former French diplomat, UN diplomat, who knows Afghanistan very well, Jean Arnaud, is going to be the Secretary General's special envoy on Afghanistan political and peace talks. So the United Nations is also gradually going to play a more important role, which also means that countries like China and Russia and India and others, Iran, Pakistan, of course, and others are also going to feel more comfortable because they will be consulted and they will be part of a larger consensus moving forward.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, I mean, there's a lot of pieces moving, as the ambassador just told us. A lot of countries are getting involved. The UN's getting involved as well. Are you not optimistic that this could lead to a solution?
Yes, I have seen lately that there is a lot of the summit in Moscow, the conference in Turkey. But, you know, in 2001, the Bonn conference, that where the Rome representatives from Pakistan, from Iran, the Northern Alliance, they were all there. That's why this founded the modern Afghanistan. You know, if the Taliban were part of that conference, I believe there would not be this 19 years of war, and there will be a different Afghanistan.
Okay.
So I see all these moving parts happening.
Yeah.
I see a potential second Bonn-style conference to decide Afghanistan. That will means the end of President Ghani's government and hopefully transition and something that could lead.
I want to go to Shuja Nawaz very quickly. Shuja, you know, we hear from the United States, well, we need more time. We also hear from NATO, we need more time. I mean, can this crisis afford more time, or will it get progressively worse the longer this is pushed down the road?
I don't think that the U.S. will get more time, and I don't think that President Biden, who knows Afghanistan and the region very well, and also knows America very well, is going to drag this out. The U.S. public wants the promise kept of withdrawing from America's forever war. And I think he wants to make sure that he brings the troops home.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.